I'm Ivana Nikolic Hughes. I'm here at Columbia as a senior lecturer, thank you, in chemistry, and I'm also, as of last year, president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, where I work with Christian Giovanni, and we have a couple of interns here as well. Jefferson, there he is, and I'm really delighted and so grateful to Anthony for including us in today's touching event. I actually live right here in the neighborhood. I live on Riverside Drive, just 2 buildings behind Sister Megan Rice's home, and I never knew this. Of course I knew about Sister Megan Rice, but I had no idea. I had walked by that building 35 Claremont so many times without knowing about her having been there as a child. And then on top of it, and Anthony alluded to this when we were at Corpus Christi Church, my youngest son, who was here at the very beginning, some of you may have seen him, he's 12, and he went to Corpus Christi for his last year before kindergarten, and had just a wonderful, fabulous year. But Anthony invited me not to talk about my family's history and commitment to nuclear disarmament. He invited me because we're standing in front of a historic building called Pupin Hall at Columbia. Anthony pronounced it actually correctly. It's Pupin. The name of the person who the building is named after, Mihailo Pupin. He was a Serbian-American inventor and scientist and professor here at Columbia. But whenever I tell Columbia people that it's really not Pupin Hall, it's Pupin Hall, they all look at me a little funny and go back to calling it Pupin. So Pupin it is. But it's really a historic place. Columbia was founded in 1754 as King's College, and then went on to be renamed Columbia College in 1784, so after the Revolutionary War. It became Columbia University in 1896, and the following year moved to this campus here. It was originally downtown, and this building, Pupin Hall, was built between 1925 and 1927 and named after Pupin in 1935. And it has been the home of the Columbia Physics Department, which I checked this morning, has had 29 Nobel Prizes for physics. And I don't quote me on this, because it's possible that that another university has more Nobel Prizes in physics, but I actually really don't think so. I checked Harvard, I checked MIT, I checked Stanford, they all had fewer. So Columbia seems to be, and that's 29 people who were either professors or students who either got their degrees in physics here at Columbia or worked here as professors. And I'm gonna highlight one event of historical importance, and then I'll highlight a couple of people who were here, and both their connections to the actual work that led to the development of nuclear weapons, but also some of the really deep and important work that jump-started the anti-nuclear movement as well. The scientists who were saying that this was actually wrong and that this shouldn't be happening. So, historical event, we're talking about end of 1938, December of 1938, over in Europe. 2 German scientists essentially did the following. They used neutrons. Neutrons are like the tiny little particles inside of atoms, but inside of the atomic nucleus. So the atomic nucleus has neutrons and protons, and then there are electrons around it. That's basically every atom of everything that we're made out of. So they used neutrons and bombarded the atom of uranium, and then they discovered this other atom, this other element called barium, and they didn't know what was happening. And a woman physicist at the time, it was almost impossible for a woman to even get a degree, let alone become a physicist, but she persevered. Her name is Lisa Meitner. She interpreted this result correctly as a result of nuclear fission, that by bombarding uranium with a neutron, they made an unstable nucleus, unstable element, which then split into two different elements. And so barium was one, and that's what they discovered. And in that process, it released a lot of energy. That process released a lot of energy. And so this was all happening by and I wrote this down just not to get the dates wrong. So by January 13, Lisa Meitner and her nephew Otto Frisch confirmed the finding, the previous finding of Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. And they did that on January 13th of 1939. By January 25th of 1939, here in the basement of Pupin, so we're now, if we actually enter the building, we would enter on the 5th floor. So the basement is down, 5 floors down, 4 floors down. And so they, in the basement, what they did is they repeated this experiment. This was the first time this experiment was done outside of Europe, here in the U.S. And the people involved were Enrico Fermi, and I'll highlight him in a second, a famous Italian physicist who had just arrived on December 2nd of 1939. Enrico Fermi had arrived escaping Nazi Italy, fascist Italy, and coming to the United States. And he had offers to go to any of the universities, and he chose to come to Columbia. So on January 25th, they're doing this, and it's Enrico Fermi, several other people, including a guy named John Dunning. And Dunning wrote in his journal, "I believe we have observed a new phenomenon of far-reaching consequence." No kidding, right? I mean, absolutely incredible. And so even the name, then there is, after this, we're looking at the letter that Einstein and Leo Szilard wrote to President Roosevelt on August 2nd of 1939. They were convinced at the time that Germany was going to get the bomb. Another famous physicist that many of you have probably heard of, Heisenberg, was in charge of the German program to build the bomb. And so they encouraged Roosevelt to start a program, which they did, and they named it Manhattan Project. And of course, we all know that ultimately the Manhattan Project would produce 3 nuclear weapons, 2 of which were used on attacks in Japan on August 6th and August 9th of 1945, and one of which was tested in New Mexico in July 16th. And so I just want to point out one thing, that there were scientists who were involved in the work who really struggled with these things, both as they were developing the weapons and of course after, and especially after they were used. But there was a report that came out, and it was a University of Chicago physicist group. It's called the Frank Report, where they essentially say, show that you could do this, saying basically, test the weapon, don't use it. And of course the politician, the government went on to use it. Oppenheimer himself had, just to use the word, approved the use of the weapon, but very, very much struggled afterwards. And there's this sort of famous thing when Oppenheimer first met Truman on October 25th of 1945, so this is a couple of months after the bombs were used. And Oppenheimer said at one point, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." And Truman was furious at Oppenheimer for even saying this, and said, "I told him the blood was on my hands to let me worry about that." And another time, Truman called Oppenheimer a crybaby scientist. But back to a little bit of Columbia history. So back to Fermi and Rabi. So there was another physicist named I. Rabi. Rabi during the war did not actually refuse to participate in the Manhattan Project. He went on instead at MIT to help develop the radar, which is actually what, in fact, won the war against Germany in particular. Rabi and Fermi were very vocal after the atomic bombs were developed, the ones that we used in Japan, and then went on to begin testing in the Marshall Islands in 1946. By the early 1950s, we were working on developing much more powerful weapons. So the weapons in Japan were based on the process of fission, atom splitting. It's what I described had happened in the basement down here. The newly developed weapons were based on the process of fusion. Atoms or atomic nuclei coming together and releasing energy that way. And Enrico Fermi and Rabi wrote that necessarily such a weapon goes far beyond any military objective and enters the range of very great natural catastrophes. By its very nature, it cannot be confined to a military objective, but becomes a weapon in which practical effect is almost one of genocide. Mentioning genocide, mentioning nuclear weapons and genocide in that document that Rabi and Fermi worked on is the only time that those two words are sort of put together in our government documents. But it's not just genocide. I want to just allude to what David was talking about just a couple of minutes ago. These weapons, of course, would flatten cities, would kill millions of people, would not just kill people instantaneously, which they would do. They would also kill them from impacts of radiation in the short term and in the long term, as we've seen from Japan, as we have seen from the nuclear weapons testing, from the decades of nuclear weapons testing. In fact, some of the redeeming work, trying to redeem this building, my husband, who's a professor of physics, and I have been working on trying to understand the radiological conditions in the Marshall Islands to sort of figure out what that looks like today and how safe it might be for the people either living there or who'd like to live there again. And the conclusion is very simple. These kinds of things are not something where you have war and then you come back and you rebuild. No, this is decades of contamination that is still present in the Marshall Islands. But it goes even beyond that, and it's that idea of nuclear winter. And as a scientist, I just want to explain this so everyone really understands. And then I'll stop talking because I've been talking too long. I'm sorry. So nuclear winter. So here's how this works. The idea is that if we have nuclear war, and nowadays we have this almost trivialization of, oh, will Russia use a nuclear? Oh, it's just going to be a tactical nuclear weapon. The war simulations out of Washington show that all it takes is one nuclear weapon to start a war, that it doesn't end on one, that it just keeps going. And so what if it keeps going? So let's even put Russia and the US aside for the moment. What if India and Pakistan get into a regional nuclear war, right? We're far away. They're gonna, let's call it nukes or not, so they're gonna nuke each other, right? They're not gonna nuke New York City. But what does that mean for the rest of the world? If India and Pakistan use their arsenals, 127 million people will die from the attacks and from the impacts of radiation. But that's not all. What would happen is you would have these burning cities, that those burning cities would put soot out into the atmosphere. The soot would cover the atmosphere, would prevent incoming sunlight from reaching us, right? That would reduce temperatures on the planet dramatically. We're talking, for India, Pakistan, we're talking 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. And I'll talk about US-Russia in just a second. And what that would do is it would essentially destroy our way of growing food. It would essentially destroy agriculture. And the estimate is over 2 billion deaths worldwide Nothing to do with just India and Pakistan, but worldwide. This truly is about humanity. If US and Russia use 1/3 of their current arsenals today, what that would lead to is over 5 billion deaths, nearly 5.5 billion deaths worldwide from starvation. The temperature drop would be 15 degrees Celsius. The average temperature on Earth right now is 15 degrees Celsius, so if it goes down, that's the average temperature on the planet becomes freezing temperature. Clearly, we're not going to have a lot of food, right? And so we're talking about something civilization ending, and it has got to stop. The only number acceptable is 0. The treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, the nuclear ban, can get us there. And we need to help this treaty get us there, because only 0 is acceptable. I'm going to end there. I apologize.
Your t-shirt and this. How did that come up? Was it your son or tandem?
It's a long-standing Nuclear Age Peace Foundation campaign, Nukes or Nuts. We just need a rock band to wear the t-shirts next.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I said this is why our Physicians for Social Responsibility say preventing what we cannot cure. Because we can't help. My husband's a transplanter who's done leukemia transplants and a plastic anemia. You can't cure this. We have to prevent it. And that's why we at Physicians for Social Responsibility and IPPNW and the International Society of Doctors for the Environment at the UN say we have to stand in solidarity with all of you. And that's why Dr. Chabano and I are here today, etc. So thank you, and thank you to everybody for what you do.
Thank you. We have 2 bills. We have 2 bills in Congress that we need to keep pushing, right? We all know, I think, here. But Congressman, Resolution 77 by Jim McGovern, right? That's a very important bill that we can all push for. But also Eleanor Holmes Norton's 2775, really important, Nuclear Abolition and Conversion Act. Taking the monies for what we use in nuclear weapons, putting it towards the climate, towards what we need. So those 2 bills, if we can keep pushing those specifically, that's our best bet with supporting our TPNW, besides the golden rule, sailing the seas and spreading the word, which you're doing. But, yeah, so thank you.
And Anthony, right here in New York, we're still pushing New York City to divest the pension funds from nuclear weapons production. So, if you don't mind, I'd love to do a quick picture from here and send it to the city controller, saying there was a wonderful coalition of peace activists, and we asked him to immediately implement the legislation that was passed to divest city pension funds from nuclear weapons production, if that's all right, Anthony.
Sure.
Let me just take a minute.
Alice,
turn around.